The doctor who warned bathing could let disease in through your pores. In the mid-14th century, as the Black Death began its merciless sweep across Europe, fear stalked every alleyway, every home, and every breath of air. The streets of Paris, once bustling with merchants, children, and music, fell into a silence so thick it seemed to hang from the rooftops like smoke. The bodies piled up faster than they could be buried. Panic turned to superstition, and superstition twisted into doctrine. Among the many desperate explanations for the spread of the plague, one theory gripped the minds of physicians and magistrates alike, that hot water could open the pores, and with them the gates to death itself. Bathing, long considered a mark of civility and health, now became a suspect act, not of vanity, but of mortal risk. According to the Paris Medical Faculty of 1348, among the most respected authorities of the medieval world, the human body, when immersed in hot water, became vulnerable to miasmas, or corrupted airs. They believed these invisible vapors, thick with plague, could be absorbed directly into the bloodstream through freshly opened pores. The hotter the bath, the wider the pores. The wider the pores, the less protection the body had from these unseen assassins. Doctors advised citizens to avoid baths altogether during outbreaks, to remain dry, to sweat less, to cover their skin in heavy garments, sealing the flesh against the air. They recommended rubbing oneself with aromatic oils, creating a kind of invisible armor. The smell wasn't just for comfort, it was a strategy, a way to repel death with scent. In this worldview, bathing didn't cleanse the body, it stripped it bare, making one a sponge for pestilence. This belief was not born of ignorance alone. At the time, the medical community was shaped by Galenic theory, which categorized health into balances of humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Disrupting that balance, particularly through temperature changes, was thought to invite illness. Warm baths were said to disrupt the body's equilibrium. They softened the flesh, relaxed the pulse, and most dangerously, they made the body porous, permeable to the very elements that were killing people by the thousands. It's crucial to remember that 14th century medicine had no concept of germs, no understanding of bacteria, no notion of microscopic invaders. Disease was environmental. It came from bad air, foul smells, eclipses, or divine wrath. So when a man bathed and then fell ill, it was not unreasonable, by their logic, to believe his pores had welcomed death inside. And in cities like Paris, where the bubonic plague would kill up to half the population, any theory, no matter how strange, held weight if it gave the illusion of control. Doctors and city officials issued proclamations. Bathhouses, once social hubs, were shuttered. Public baths, common throughout medieval Europe, fell into disuse. In some towns, they were even outlawed during peak plague periods. Instead of soap and water, people turned to powders, perfumes, and rituals. To sweat was dangerous. To be clean, ironically, was even more so. The result? A Europe that grew increasingly fearful of water, not rivers or rain, but of the act of washing oneself. Cleanliness, once tied to godliness, was now linked to death. People wore the same clothes for weeks. They layered themselves with protective fabrics soaked in vinegar and herbs. Some physicians advised plugging the nose with sponges dipped in scented oils to avoid inhaling bad air. Others carried pomanders or posies, bundles of fragrant flowers pressed to their face. Bathing became a secretive act, if it happened at all, and for many, particularly the poor, it disappeared from daily life entirely. But even this wasn't new. Suspicion toward bathing had been growing since the decline of the Roman Empire, whose sophisticated aqueducts and bathhouses fell into disrepair. By the 14th century, many European towns had no public water infrastructure at all. Clean water was a luxury, warm water even more so. The idea that water could cleanse sin or heal the body gave way to a belief that it carried disease, stirred corruption, or invited evil spirits to enter. Still, the fear during the plague years made everything worse. It cemented the idea that touch, air, and cleanliness itself were all conspirators in a silent war, and the theory about bathing, once just one of many fringe beliefs, became a central piece of plague doctrine. Of course, hindsight now exposes the tragic irony. We know today that the plague was spread by fleas on rats, that it traveled through blood, bites, and filth, not water. The very act that might have helped, washing away germs, cleaning wounds, scrubbing infected hands, was discouraged. Out of fear, out of desperation, out of a desperate human need to believe that something, anything, was still in our control. There were doctors who resisted, quiet voices who insisted that cleanliness might still matter, that water might not be the enemy. But their warnings were drowned beneath waves of panic. The dominant belief was too strong, the fear too contagious. And so, a strange doctrine took hold, the idea that to protect your body, you had to close it off, that to survive the plague, you must remain sealed, dry, distant, and untouched. Today, we bathe freely, even compulsively. We associate water with wellness, hygiene, and life. But in 14th century Paris, during one of humanity's darkest chapters, bathing was a threat. And a doctor's warning that open pores could welcome death was not laughed at. It was law. It reminds us of how deeply fear shapes belief, how medicine evolves through both failure and survival, and how the body itself, flesh and bone and pore, becomes a battlefield when the enemy is invisible. Centuries later, we look back with sympathy, not mockery. These were not fools. These were people staring down a horror they didn't understand, reaching into the dark for answers. And if one of those answers was to seal the skin and fear the bath, it was only because they were trying, desperately, to survive the flood without knowing how deep the water truly went. The public bathhouses shut down by the church for being sinful. In the twilight of the 13th century, as the great cathedrals of Europe rose like stone prayers into the sky, another structure, far humbler, yet no less significant to everyday life, was being quietly dismantled, not by fire or war, but by judgment. The communal bathhouse, once a place of cleanliness, fellowship, and even healing, had become a target of religious suspicion, not because it was unsanitary, but because it was seen as sinful. Across medieval towns and cities, bathhouses had long served a crucial role. They offered warm respite from the cold, a way to cleanse the body in an age when soap was expensive and private tubs were a luxury few could afford. Men and women, nobles and peasants alike, sat side by side in the steam, their bodies stripped not just of clothing, but of social status. In the bathhouse, they were equals, sweating, scrubbing, talking, laughing, and that, perhaps, was the problem. For the church, whose influence permeated every aspect of medieval life, communal nudity carried dangerous connotations. At first, the concern was subtle, a warning here, a sermon there, but by the late 1200s, the pressure intensified. Moral panic began to fester. Religious officials claimed that these public bathhouses were breeding grounds not only for temptation, but for lust, lewdness, and even prostitution. The mere sight of skin, wet, glistening, unhidden, was thought to stir base desires, even among the most pious. Records from the period show that monasteries near cities with flourishing bathhouse cultures often took it upon themselves to investigate. Some monks wrote of being scandalized by the undignified mingling of the sexes. Others went further, accusing bathhouses of being brothels in disguise. The line between cleanliness and carnality, they argued, had vanished in the steam. The truth, as always, was more complicated. While it's undeniable that some bathhouses had evolved into places where sexual services were discreetly offered, especially in larger towns, this was not the norm everywhere. But perception often outweighs fact, and the church's perception was increasingly one of moral rot. So, the closures began. City by city, town by town. Sometimes orders were handed down directly from bishops or church councils. Other times, local rulers, eager to demonstrate their spiritual fidelity, preemptively shut them down. Entire bathhouse districts went dark. Pools were drained. Doors were barred. The sound of laughter and splashing water gave way to glance, and the dry scratch of sermons etched into public consciousness. What made these closures particularly striking was that they flew in the face of health logic. In an era before germ theory, people still understood the basic benefit of washing. Bathing reduced body lice, softened hardened skin, and provided rare relief from the filth of crowded medieval life. In fact, many bathhouses had been modeled after Roman baths, equipped with hot and cold pools, benches for messages, and even attendants trained in minor therapeutic techniques. But in the eyes of the Church, the risk to the soul outweighed the benefit to the body. Cleanliness, once godly, had become suspicious. The very act of caring for one's flesh was increasingly framed as vanity, even decadence. The bathhouse was no longer a sanctuary. It was a den of potential sin. Ironically, some of the fiercest criticism came from within the clergy. Certain reformist monks and priests began denouncing their own brethren for frequenting bathhouses under the guise of health, while indulging in what they called steamed temptation. Confessional records show waves of guilt among the devout, not for crimes of violence or theft, but for something as mundane as bathing too often or gazing too long. And so, the bathhouse faded from the urban landscape, not by fire or collapse, but by moral decree. In its absence, private hygiene suffered. It wasn't until centuries later, during the Renaissance and beyond, that washing was once again encouraged publicly and scientifically. By then, the old bathhouses were rubble or repurposed, their history obscured by time and shame. This forgotten chapter reminds us of the strange turns history takes when morality becomes weaponized. Where once the communal bath was a symbol of health and humanity, it became, for a time, a threat to the soul. And in the end, what was lost wasn't just a place to get clean. It was a shared human ritual, wiped away by judgment, fear, and the long shadow of authority. The king who bragged he hadn't bathed in years. In the long corridors of medieval power, where whispers were weapons and courtly rituals were laced with the scent of rot, there reigned a monarch who, despite his influence and intellect, chose to defy one of the most basic rituals of personal care. King James IV of Scotland, a ruler praised for his scholarly pursuits, surgical experiments, and political maneuverings, harbored a strange belief, a conviction so rooted in the era's superstitions that it would turn the modern stomach. He prided himself on his aversion to bathing. This wasn't mere forgetfulness or a passing eccentricity. It was a stance, almost philosophical, deeply rooted in medieval medicine and royal tradition. James IV, who ruled from 1488 until his death in 1513, was considered a Renaissance king in many respects. He spoke multiple languages, funded the first printing press in Scotland, and even performed surgery on the poor to better understand the human body. Yet, when it came to hygiene, he regressed into the shadows of medieval thought. It is said that he often wore the same garments for months, allowing the layers to accumulate grime, sweat, and the scent of monarchy. To him, and many of his contemporaries, water was a potential vector of disease, a dangerous element that could destabilize the body's humors, leaving one vulnerable to illness and death. This wasn't an idea James concocted in solitude. Medieval and early Renaissance Europe were dominated by Galenic theories of medicine, passed down from ancient Greece. The human body, according to Galen, was governed by four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Health depended on a careful balance between these. Bathing, particularly with hot water, was believed to open the pores, which in turn could allow bad air, or miasma, to seep in and corrupt the internal balance. The same reasoning led physicians to recommend avoiding night air, covering the mouth with herbs in plague time, and sealing off windows during outbreaks. Water was not cleansing in the modern hygienic sense. It was a threat. This belief was so widespread that public bathhouses across Europe began to close, not just due to religious disapproval or fears of moral corruption, but because they were seen as medically dangerous. To bathe was to risk infection, and to risk infection was to risk weakening not only the body, but, in a sense, the soul. Within this context, King James IV's reluctance to bathe becomes less absurd and more emblematic of his age. He wasn't being careless, he was being cautious. In a world teetering constantly on the edge of plague, famine, and spiritual uncertainty, the body was a fortress. Every pore was a gate, every breeze a potential invader. To keep the gate sealed was an act of preservation, even power. But the irony lies in James's paradoxical love of scientific inquiry. He kept a full-time alchemist. He funded surgical experiments, including some rumored to be shockingly cruel by modern standards, such as isolating a child on an island with a mute caregiver to study the development of language. He invited scholars and thinkers to his court, craving knowledge in its purest, most experimental form. Yet he clung to ancient medical ideas with a tenacity that defied his otherwise progressive nature. Why? Because even the most educated men of his time were still shackled to the frameworks that defined medieval Europe. The Renaissance had begun, yes, but it had not yet triumphed. The printing press was new. The microscope didn't yet exist. Germ theory wouldn't surface for centuries. In this liminal period, the human body remained a mystery, cloaked in superstition, and kings, no matter how powerful, were not immune to fear. There are surviving reports and letters that hint at James's aversion to regular cleanliness. One English observer noted the Scottish court's particular odor, commenting on the rank stench of unwashed nobility. It wasn't merely the king. His habits reflected those of an entire class, an entire culture. The aristocracy wore fine clothing, but changed them rarely. Underneath the silks and velvets, their skin told another story, one of grease, filth, and the desperate effort to avoid disease by denying the very concept of hygiene. To bathe, in their minds, was not refreshing. It was dangerous. A naked body, soaked and steaming, was seen as exposed, physically and spiritually. And so James would continue, layer after layer of clothing, hiding not only his skin, but his fear. The same man who believed he could cut into a cadaver to learn its secrets would not dare to immerse himself in a tub of warm water. It's worth noting that this wasn't unique to Scotland. Across Europe, from the French courts to the Spanish palaces, nobles adopted similar views. Louis XIV of France reportedly bathed only twice in his life, and Queen Elizabeth I of England was said to bathe once a month, whether she needed it or not. The notion that washing too frequently was not only unnecessary, but risky shaped centuries of noble behavior. Perfume wasn't just a luxury, it was a necessity, a weapon in the war against one's own body odor. So when King James IV boasted that he hadn't bathed in years, it wasn't shameful. It was a signal, a declaration of prudence, wisdom, even piety. To his peers, he was not neglecting his health, he was guarding it. And that sense of vigilance, misguided though it seems to us now, was what made a man fit to rule. He would die in 1513 at the Battle of Flodden, the last British monarch to die in battle. His body, reportedly stripped and looted by enemies, lay in the mud, not in a ceremonial bath, not in the sacred washings of a holy ritual. There was no cleansing at the end, only blood, earth, and the ironic truth that even a king who refused to wash could not escape decay. And in that, perhaps, lies the most haunting lesson of all. For all his education, for all his status, for all his attempts to control the balance of his body's inner world, James IV was still made of flesh, still bound to the same mortality as the peasants he ruled. Dirt, sweat, fear, it clung to them all, no matter the title. What began as a boast, a refusal to bathe, wasn't just about soap or superstition. It was a mirror held up to an era's misunderstanding of the body, a reminder that knowledge without revision can become ignorance in disguise. and that history's kings, like the rest of us, are sometimes defined not by what they embraced, but by what they feared to touch, even if it was only water. Why medieval people preferred dry washing with linen and ash. In the winding alleys of medieval Europe, where cobblestone streets ran thick with the scent of animals, damp earth, and smoke, cleanliness was never taken for granted, and bathing, contrary to modern assumptions, was not the mark of refinement. Instead, it was often considered a dangerous indulgence. While great stone castles towered over villages and peasants toiled in fields from sunrise to dusk, a curious and deeply misunderstood ritual of hygiene quietly persisted: dry washing, a method that, to us today, might seem primitive or unsanitary. But to those who lived under the shadow of plague, superstition, and shifting scientific theory, it was a calculated act of survival. Most people, nobles and commoners alike, did not regularly soak themselves in water. Water, they believed, could open the pores, and open pores were entryways, not to relief or freshness, but to disease. The body, they thought, had to be sealed, protected like armor against invisible invaders. This belief was reinforced during waves of devastating plagues, such as the Black Death, which swept through cities and countrysides, taking millions of lives. Physicians, guided by the medical understandings of Galen and Hippocrates, warned that bathing in hot water would weaken the body's natural defenses and invite corruption into the bloodstream. In fact, one widely circulated belief held that hot water made the skin spongy, soaking up the air's toxic vapors like a sponge absorbing poison. So what did people do instead? They turned to dry washing, a method less about removing dirt and more about preserving health. The tools of this practice were humble: linen cloths, ashes from fireplaces, and sometimes vinegar or aromatic herbs. Linen, widely available and valued for its softness and absorbency, was the preferred material. People would rub their skin with a dry or slightly dampened linen cloth, scrubbing away sweat, dead skin, and oils. When vinegar was used, it added a mild antiseptic quality, and its sharp scent masked body odor. Ashes, often from burned wood, were alkaline and could cut through grease. Combined with a rough cloth, they worked as a kind of exfoliant and deodorizer. These practices weren't entirely ineffective. In fact, they mimicked the use of abrasive soaps, which were expensive and difficult to obtain. Soap, when available, was made through a complicated and costly process, usually requiring animal fats and lye. The lye was often derived from ashes mixed with water. It had to be boiled and handled carefully, as it could burn the skin if made improperly. For many peasants, soap was too expensive, too risky, and too unfamiliar to use regularly. And even the wealthiest nobles might choose instead to scent themselves with perfumed powders, oils, or vinegar washes. Cleanliness was often a matter of perception rather than microbial science. To smell fresh and to appear tidy in finely woven clothes was often enough. Moreover, the idea of clean was tied more closely to moral and spiritual purity than physical hygiene. A person who looked outwardly composed and avoided indulgent practices like frequent bathing was seen as disciplined and virtuous. The church also played a role in reinforcing these beliefs. While monastic communities did have bathhouses and promoted ritual washing, they also warned against vanity, immodesty, and excessive attention to the body. Communal bathhouses, once common in parts of Europe during the early medieval and Roman periods, gradually came to be viewed as suspicious, associated with sin, sexual immorality, or even witchcraft. In this context, dry washing wasn't just a practical adaptation, it was a cultural defense against illness, sin, and disorder. Medical theories of the time emphasized humors and balance. People believed that smells, known as miasmas, carried disease. So anything that could keep the body sealed and odorless was a form of protection. In fact, doctors might recommend that their patients avoid bathing altogether during times of plague. The wealthy even lined their homes with fragrant herbs or carried scented pomanders to purify the air around them. Baths were often saved for rare occasions or used medicinally under strict supervision, with herbs added for their supposed protective properties. Interestingly, medieval people were not entirely oblivious to the idea of sanitation. They washed their hands and faces regularly, and linens were washed with great care. Clothes were changed more frequently than you might expect, not always for aesthetic reasons, but because linen next to the skin could absorb sweat and body oils. This idea that changing one's shirt was equivalent to cleaning the body was widespread. The shirt acted like a sponge, soaking up the impurities from the skin and holding them away from the body. By removing and washing the shirt, one was believed to be removing those impurities as well. Some aristocrats would go even further, perfuming their clothes and wiping their faces with scented cloths rather than ever touching water. The obsession with covering up body smells and projecting cleanliness through outward appearance created a hierarchy of hygiene, where true cleanliness was less about sterilization and more about sensory presentation. To smell of lavender or rosemary was to smell clean. To have white, unblemished linen on your body suggested purity, discipline, and wealth. The idea of full bathing, as we understand it today, soaking in tubs, using soap to lather and rinse, was limited to certain communities and often reserved for special events. It was an act one might undertake before marriage, after childbirth, or during illness, but rarely as a daily or weekly ritual. The infrastructure just didn't support it. Water had to be fetched by hand, heated with firewood, and then emptied. In cities, especially, bathhouses eventually became associated with disease rather than health, and many were shut down. This shift toward dry hygiene persisted well into the Renaissance and even into the early modern period. The French court under Louis XIV, for instance, famously masked body odor with perfume rather than soap. In many ways, medieval practices of dry washing were not simply backward, they were adaptive, born from the limitations of infrastructure, the prevailing medical theories, and the ever-present threat of epidemic. It was a hygiene system built not on germs and antiseptics, but on balance, smell, texture, and ritual. When we look back at these practices, we might be tempted to scoff at their simplicity or see them as proof of medieval ignorance. But to do so is to miss the deeper truth. These people were working within a vastly different understanding of the body, health, and danger. In a world without antibiotics, without microbiology, and with little clean running water, dry washing offered a compromise. It was less about cleanliness as we know it, and more about control. Control over the body's boundaries, control over how one was perceived, and ultimately, control over a world that often felt far beyond human grasp. That's why they scrubbed with ash instead of soap, and vinegar instead of water. Because in their minds, to soak the skin was to soak the soul, and that, they feared, might let the darkness in. When clean water meant disease, the river baths. That killed people. Imagine standing waist-deep in a cool, flowing river, sunlight flickering off the surface, the sounds of laughter echoing across the water. In medieval Europe, this was not just a summer retreat, it was a ritual of health, cleanliness, and faith. River baths were praised as holy blessings, the waters believed to cleanse not only the skin, but the soul. Communities gathered here to wash, to pray, to feel pure. And yet, beneath this current of good intentions, an invisible danger festered. In the heart of many towns, rivers served as lifelines, sources of drinking water, washing, trade routes, and yes, bathing. But they were also sewers. Chamber pots were emptied directly into the water. Tanners dumped chemical waste. Butchers rinsed blood from freshly slaughtered animals into the stream. Upstream filth met downstream innocence. And the bathers? They were the first victims of what no one yet understood: contaminated water. The medieval mind had no concept of bacteria, no understanding of microscopic life. Illness was attributed to miasma, bad air, or divine punishment. So, when the healthiest townsfolk, Those who bathed regularly began falling ill. The irony went unnoticed. The association between clean water and disease was hidden in plain sight. Take the example of Paris. The River Seine was central to city life. Bathhouses lined the banks, and people of all classes submerged themselves regularly, sometimes even believing the water had healing powers. But upstream, refuse flowed freely from hundreds of homes. Dead animals, human waste, rotting food, all swept downstream into the very places people soaked their skin and opened their pores. By the 13th century, outbreaks of dysentery, cholera-like symptoms, and mysterious fevers became common near popular bathing points. Authorities noticed the correlation but couldn't pinpoint the cause. Instead of blaming the water, they blamed the temperature of the baths, or the air, or even moral decay. Water, after all, was considered sacred. Pilgrims believed certain rivers held divine power. To suggest otherwise was heresy. Even worse, many bathers drank from these rivers as they bathed, unaware they were swallowing invisible killers. Boiling water was rare. It took too long and used up precious firewood. So, in hot summer months, families cooled off in river baths and quenched their thirst with what they believed was nature's gift, never suspecting that gift carried the seeds of their own suffering. In London, the River Thames was no cleaner. Waste disposal regulations existed on paper, but enforcement was nearly impossible. Tanneries and breweries operated near the banks, and their byproducts poured in daily. The fish vanished. The stench grew unbearable. And yet, the baths continued. The tragedy deepened in towns where river bathing was part of religious practice. Monks and nuns often followed strict cleanliness rituals, which ironically exposed them more frequently to polluted water. In monasteries, entire communities would fall sick after collective baths. Chronicles record deaths in patterns, but no one realized the water was to blame. The irony reached its darkest point during times of plague. During the Black Death, many believed that washing would open the skin's pores and allow disease in. So bathing stopped for some, but not all. Those who continued to bathe, hoping to cleanse away the sickness, often made themselves even more vulnerable. River water was not only shared with livestock, but also became the final resting place of the dead. Corpses were dumped to avoid spreading plague by land, poisoning the water further. Even as centuries passed, the illusion of river purity persisted. In some towns, elaborate bathing platforms were constructed, floating wooden stages anchored to riverbanks, allowing dozens to bathe in privacy. But they did nothing to filter or clean the water. In some areas, upstream communities held power over life and death downstream. A simple tannery releasing waste could devastate a village miles away, and no one would ever know the connection. Doctors remained puzzled. The idea that something unseen in water could cause illness was too radical. The tools didn't exist to detect bacteria. It wasn't until the 19th century, centuries after the damage had been done, that scientists like John Snow and Louis Pasteur would begin to unravel the truth, one painful death at a time. By then, millions had bathed in rivers, thinking it was good for them. Cleanliness equaled holiness. But holiness had no filter, and while soap was used by some, it was expensive. Ash and vinegar were common substitutes, but they didn't sterilize. If anything, they gave a false sense of cleanliness. The tragedy was cultural. Water was associated with purity in religious texts. Holy water, baptism, healing springs, all told people that water couldn't possibly hurt them. And so they trusted the river. They taught their children to trust it. They built their homes near it. And then they died beside it, never knowing that their cleanliness rituals were quietly killing them. Today, we take water safety for granted. Filtration, sanitation, chlorination, all invisible shields protecting us from the same ancient enemy. But in the Middle Ages, there were no shields, only flowing water, sunlit surfaces, and a hidden death riding the current. Clean water meant hope. Clean water meant status. Clean water meant God. But when the rivers ran black with filth, no one saw the danger. They only saw tradition. They only saw belief. And belief, like the water they trusted, betrayed them. This was not a tale of neglect, but of misled faith, where the very act of seeking health became the path to suffering. And as towns grew, so did their rivers of ECKs. The bathers remained, hopeful, devout, and doomed. So next time you turn on a faucet and drink without fear, remember them. The ones who stepped into rivers believing they were cleansing their sins, only to be washed away by something they couldn't see. The physician who declared bathing made you too soft. In an age of steel, mud, and war cries, a strange doctrine took root in the minds of Europe's most respected physicians that bathing, not bloodshed, was the greater threat to the warrior's body. It was the 13th century. Castles stood cold against gray skies. Fields were battlegrounds. And the line between survival and death was written in muscle, grit, and calloused skin. Strength was not only revered, it was mandatory. And into this world came a warning, quietly scribbled into the margins of medieval medical texts, that to bathe too often was to become too soft. This wasn't superstition, it was science, at least as they knew it. According to prevailing humoral theory, the body was a balance of 4 fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Keeping these humors in check meant controlling exposure, temperature, and sensation. Bathing, especially in hot water, was said to disrupt this delicate balance. But more importantly, it was believed to rob the body of its natural resistance. Medieval physicians wrote with certainty. Frequent bathing softened the skin, relaxed the sinews, dulled the nerves. A man bathed too often, they warned, became less tolerant of cold, of pain, of discomfort. He became delicate, fragile, unfit for hardship. And in a world ruled by hardship, that made him dangerous. Among knights, squires, and foot soldiers, this belief took hold not just as medical advice, but as a code. A warrior needed to be hard. Bathing was indulgence. Worse, bathing was weakness, and weakness could get you killed. Medical compendiums from the period, like the Tacuinum Sanitatis, advised moderation in cleanliness. A bath, it said, might be permitted after certain exertions or illnesses, but only under strict conditions. The water must not be too warm. The body must be rubbed dry with coarse cloths afterward. And a man who bathed for luxury, not necessity, was slowly corrupting the very strength that might one day save his life. To be dirty, they believed, was not only natural, it was proof of endurance. The sweat and soil of a soldier's skin formed a kind of armor, both literal and symbolic. And to strip it away with hot water and soap, that was vanity, that was sin, that was softness. These ideas weren't confined to dusty texts. They were echoed in barracks, in royal courts, even in church sermons. Monks advised humility in bodily care. Knights bathed less than once a month, if at all. And kings, even with access to perfumed baths and silver tubs, limited their washing, fearing the weakening of flesh and will. There are stories of generals refusing to allow their soldiers to bathe before battle, not for fear of illness, but to preserve edge, to keep their bodies toughened by filth and fatigue. A clean soldier was a man removed from struggle, his hands too smooth, his nerves too dulled, his body too pampered. Pain was considered proof of life. Discomfort, a kind of moral virtue. Endurance wasn't just strategic, it was spiritual. And so the body became a battlefield long before swords clashed. Every ache, every callus, every hardened layer of skin was seen as earned, maintained, protected. What's more chilling is how these ideas mirrored deeper beliefs about society. The clean were suspect. The soft were ridiculed. Dirt, in this context, was honesty. It showed you worked. It showed you bled. And it showed you didn't flinch from the brutal reality of the world. Contrast that with modern times, where hygiene is a symbol of care, health, and dignity. Today, cleanliness is a right. Back then, it was a liability. To bathe was to strip the body of its defenses, to smooth its rough edges, to make it, God forbid, sensitive. And while this belief seems alien to us, it was rooted in fear. The fear that the comforts of civilization might undo the very qualities that allowed civilization to survive. Doctors even warned that children who were bathed too often would grow up weak, their bodies less able to tolerate hunger, cold, or pain. Toughness had to be built, layer by layer, like armor, and water, they believed, washed that armor away. So when you picture a medieval knight caked in dust and blood, know this: it wasn't just the battlefield that kept him unwashed. It was belief. It was doctrine. It was the medical consensus of the time. And to disobey it, to clean oneself too thoroughly or too often, was not only risky, it was rebellious. Of course, there were exceptions. Certain scholars in Moorish Spain and among the Arabic medical community championed the health benefits of regular bathing and even constructed complex bathhouses with scientific precision. But in much of medieval Europe, these ideas were ignored, or worse, feared as foreign and weakening. It wasn't until centuries later, with the rise of Renaissance humanism and growing scientific understanding, that the tide began to turn. Slowly, the idea of bathing as healing, not corrupting, emerged. The body was no longer seen as something to harden through suffering, but as something to protect through care. But for hundreds of years, the message was clear. If you wanted to be strong, you had to stay rough. If you wanted to endure pain, you had to embrace discomfort. And if you wanted to be ready for war, you had to resist the bath, not because of germs, but because of grit. And so the history of cleanliness is stained with contradiction. There was a time, not long ago, when doctors told us that water made us weak and the dirt beneath our nails was a badge of honor, that sweat, stink, and scars weren't problems to be scrubbed away, but signs that we were ready to survive the world as it truly was. The ice bath punishment for excessive cleanliness. In the winter of 1275, in a stone monastery nestled deep within northern England's frost-bitten countryside, a silent ritual unfolded that few today would believe. A monk, humble, devout, obedient, was led to a half-frozen river by his brethren. His crime? Not blasphemy, not theft, not violence, but bathing too often. His punishment? To be forcibly dunked into the frigid water as penance for what the church called vain self-care. In the eyes of his peers, he was guilty of indulging in his own flesh. This is no legend. The record survives in brittle monastic notes, warning against the creeping sin of bodily pride. At a time when hygiene was more spiritual than physical, bathing more than once a week was considered suspicious, more than twice, heretical. This monk, unnamed in the record but likely no more than 30, had been seen cleansing himself several times within a week. Fellow monks noticed, and they judged. The sin was not in the act alone, but in its perceived motive: vanity, pride in the physical body, a lust, not for others, but for one's own comfort. In medieval monastic life, humility was law. Monks shaved their heads not for style, but as a mark of surrender. They wore coarse wool robes, ate simple food, and spoke rarely. To care too much for the body was to risk elevating it above the soul. And in this climate, even something as innocent as washing could be twisted into spiritual rebellion. The northern monasteries, particularly those on the edges of England, were known for their severity. The biting cold, the isolation, the austerity, it forged a specific kind of devotion. In these places, bathing was not routine. It was rationed, often permitted only on major holy days or when illness demanded it. To cleanse oneself more frequently was to break an unspoken code. And so, the monk was summoned. No accusations, no trial, just silent nods and scripture-laden glances. They led him out into the snow, robes soaked from the wet air. He did not resist. He may have even accepted the act as just. When they reached the river, They cut a jagged hole through the ice. Cold mist rose like a ghost from the wound in the water. Then, without ceremony, he was submerged. It was not meant to kill him, but to strip him, not of dirt, but of pride, to remind him that the body is not to be indulged, but endured. The cold was a cleanser holier than soap, harsher than heat. It was meant to purge the flesh of the desire for comfort, to reset the priorities of a soul too preoccupied with skin. What's striking is not just the brutality of the act, but its reasoning. This wasn't about disease. In fact, in 1275, there was a growing awareness that water could be dangerous, especially in winter. The cold could seize the heart. The shock could cause death. Yet the risk was seen as righteous. To suffer for spiritual hygiene was considered better than to glow with physical health earned through excessive care. This wasn't an isolated incident. Throughout the 13th century, the Church's suspicion of cleanliness deepened. While earlier Christian traditions saw cleanliness as a virtue, cleanliness is next to godliness. The medieval reinterpretation grew darker. Clean skin began to signal hidden sin. It was said that the devil loves a clean man who stinks of pride more than a dirty one who stinks of humility. Such thinking created a paradox. Cleanliness, once a sign of moral purity, became a red flag. And those who bathed regularly weren't admired, but watched. Rumors of monks who secretly soaked spread like whispers in the refectory. Some even claimed that frequent bathing softened a man's spirit, making him more vulnerable to temptation. That's what this monk faced. Not a fear of disease, but a fear of disobedience cloaked in soap. His crime wasn't cleanliness. It was what that cleanliness might symbolize: a private desire, a secret sense of superiority, a breaking of monastic uniformity. In punishing him, the Brotherhood wasn't just enforcing rules. They were defending their ideology. It's easy to view this moment with modern disdain, to scoff at men who feared baths more than filth. But that would miss the depth of their conviction. In a world where plague, famine, and war loomed daily, controlling the body, limiting its pleasures, felt like the only defense against chaos. If the world was painful, then comfort was dangerous. If life was short, then the soul had to be hardened, not pampered. What became of the monk, we don't know. He disappears from the records as quietly as he entered, but the ripple of his punishment echoes, not just in history, but in how societies still sometimes treat self-care, as indulgence, as weakness, as something to be earned rather than granted. His frozen breath on that riverbank is a haunting reminder of a time when purity was measured not in cleanliness, but in how much suffering you were willing to endure for it. Why nobles bathed once a year and celebrated it like a holiday. In a world where cleanliness was once considered suspect, bathing, something we now take for granted, was, for centuries, a rare and ceremonial event. For the European nobility during the medieval and early Renaissance periods, stepping into a bath was not a daily routine, but an annual spectacle, a ritual loaded with symbolism, superstition, and social meaning. Imagine waiting an entire year for your one sanctioned bath, then treating it like a sacred rite. Because for many nobles, that's exactly what it was. In certain regions of medieval Europe, the yearly bath was more than hygiene. It was a celebration, a spiritual and social renewal. Often held around major feast days, such as Easter or Midsummer, it marked not only a washing of the body, but a cleansing of the soul. It was a time when the boundaries between physical and spiritual purity blurred, and where water, usually feared as a gateway for illness, was embraced, but only under the strictest ritual circumstances. The bath itself was elaborate. Herbs like lavender, rosemary, and thyme were steeped in boiling water and poured into large wooden tubs lined with linen. The air would be filled with fragrant steam. Musicians might play soft instruments nearby, and servants would carefully prepare robes, towels, and scented oils. For nobles, this was not about scrubbing with soap. It was about orchestrating an event that symbolized rebirth. The bath was a performance, and the bather was both participant and centerpiece. At the heart of this ceremony was an ancient idea that water could cleanse sin, that immersion could purify not just the flesh, but the soul. And yet, paradoxically, water was also feared. Medieval medical theories warned against frequent bathing. Physicians advised that warm water opened the pores, making the body vulnerable to miasma, the bad air thought to carry disease. So, while peasants working in rivers or sweating in fields might wash more frequently out of necessity, nobles avoided water unless the calendar and the church gave them permission. And when that permission came, once or twice a year, it was an event worth celebrating. The ritual bath was often scheduled alongside other cleansing rites like confession or fasting. Some courts even hosted bathing feasts. Nobles would bathe ceremonially, dress in fresh garments, and then gather for lavish meals featuring roasted meats, spiced wines, and music. These moments fused piety with pleasure, hygiene with holiness. But the extravagance didn't end with the bath. Some nobles went to great lengths to make their annual wash memorable. There are accounts of bathhouses draped in silks, bathwater perfumed with rare oils, and entire suites constructed for the purpose of a single cleansing. A noblewoman in 15th century France once bathed in rosewater warmed by fire-heated stones, while a Bavarian duke imported special herbs from Italy for his annual bathing ceremony. This wasn't a utilitarian affair. It was theatrical, indulgent, and rich with status. These bathing festivals also served a political function. To be seen bathing, to be seen cared for, adored, pampered, was a subtle demonstration of power. Royal bathers were not just washing themselves, they were reaffirming their privilege. The servants who attended, the rare oils they used, the musicians who played, each element reinforced the idea that this person was above the daily grime of life. They could afford to be clean, even if just once a year. But beneath the pageantry, there lingered a fear, a hesitation born of centuries of medical dogma and religious doctrine. Too much cleanliness, it was believed, weakened the body. It was not uncommon to find manuals advising nobles to wash only their hands and face regularly, leaving the rest of the body to remain untouched for months. Clothing acted as a barrier, and perfumes disguised what water dared not confront. Skin was something to protect, not scrub. Dirt was invisible armor. This helps explain why nobles clung so tightly to these rare moments of bathing. In a time when people feared the unseen, disease, sin, curses, ritual offered control. Bathing once a year allowed them to acknowledge their humanity without risking it. They could immerse themselves in the water, then emerge renewed, believing they had washed away a year's worth of corruption, both moral and physical. It's easy now to look back in disbelief. We shower daily, use antiseptics, obsess over hygiene. But for much of history, cleanliness was not equated with health. It was a gamble, an indulgence, even a rebellion against medical advice. And when it was done, it had to be done right, wrapped in ritual, music, and meaning. To bathe was not just to clean, it was to declare, for a fleeting moment, mastery over one's body, one's soul, and the forces that threatened them. So when a noble stepped into a tub once a year, it wasn't laziness, it was reverence, it was fear, it was tradition, wrapped in perfume and ceremony. And when they stepped out, skin warm, senses restored, they were not just refreshed. They were reborn in the eyes of their peers, even if only for a night. In a world where water was both sacred and suspect, one bath could become a holy event. The village that bathed together, once a month, then stopped forever. In the forested hills of medieval Bohemia, nestled among the winding rivers and quiet farmland, stood a village with an ancient tradition, one that spoke not only to hygiene, but to community, trust, and rhythm. Once a month, on the first clear night after the full moon, the villagers would gather in their public bathhouse, a timber-framed building warmed by coals and perfumed with bundles of herbs. Families would arrive in clusters carrying fresh linens, jugs of vinegar, and bundles of wild thyme. Children splashed, elders soaked, and the middle-aged scrubbed away the wear of field and forge. For this one evening, the worries of the world fell silent beneath the steam rising into the rafters. It was not just about getting clean. This was ritual. The warm water, drawn from nearby springs, was sacred in its own right. Women hummed lullabies while rinsing their daughters' hair. Men shared ale and stories by the benches. Even the village priest was known to attend, not in ceremony, but in spirit, often sitting quietly with his feet in the shallows, offering whispered blessings to anyone who asked. In a world that so often tore people apart with hardship, poverty, and superstition, these bath nights brought people together. But everything changed in the spring of 1349. That year, the Black Death arrived. It came not like a storm, but like a whisper at first. A rumor carried by traders passing through distant towns, a merchant found dead in the next province. Then came the symptoms. First a fever, then boils under the arms and around the groin, blackened skin, bloody coughs, and death, quick and merciless. At first, they thought it might be the water, or the meat, or the wind itself. But soon, after 3 families died within a week of attending the monthly bath, suspicion turned toward the bathhouse. In those days, people did not understand germs. They believed in miasmas, foul airs that brought disease. They believed the body was governed by humors and that the skin, once warmed and opened by hot water, became vulnerable, porous to whatever rot floated invisibly through the village. And so, the question quickly became unavoidable. What if it was the baths that were killing them? The next month, no one gathered. The coals remained unlit. The doors were chained shut by order of the village elder. The priest did not protest. In fact, he was the one who delivered the decree. The bathhouse was a sin now, a temptation of the flesh that had drawn God's wrath. To soak the body, he warned, is to open it to the devil's breath. The building was left to rot. Rain soaked the herbs that once hung in fragrant bundles by its beams. The tubs cracked and split from frost. Weeds grew wild through the stone foundation. Children were warned not to go near it. A place of warmth and laughter became a symbol of punishment. The community that had once found comfort in each other's presence now began to isolate. They washed privately, if at all. Dry cloths soaked in vinegar became the new way. Ashes from the hearth replaced soap. Touch, once a comfort, was now feared. Survivors of the plague whispered stories of the dead who had last bathed together. They spoke of cursed steam, of evil spirits drawn to warm flesh. Some claimed to hear moaning at night from the old bathhouse, the cries of those whose bodies were never buried properly. Fear fossilized into folklore. Generations passed, and the bathhouse remained shuttered. Children born decades later grew up hearing ghost stories about the cursed water. No one remembered the comfort it once offered, only the terror that followed. Even after the plague had long faded from memory and Europe began to rebuild, the village refused to revive its bathing ritual. In nearby towns, new bathhouses opened. Hygiene changed. Soap became more common. But here, in this one forgotten place, they clung to the old warning, do not bathe together, do not tempt fate. By the 16th century, travelers would sometimes pass through and ask the villagers why there were no bathhouses. The answers were always vague. It's not our way, they'd say, or there's sickness in the steam. But for those who dared ask the elders, the story always came back, the story of 1349. The night the water turned black, the night laughter turned to coughing, the night the village stopped bathing together forever. Today, little remains of that village. The old bathhouse is just a crumbled foundation buried in moss and dirt. A few records in dusty Bohemian archives confirm that such a place existed, and that its population sharply declined around the time the Black Death swept through the region. Local folklore still speaks of a plague curse, that punishes those who cleanse together. Anthropologists who study medieval hygiene practices cite the village as a rare but revealing example of how deeply fear can reshape culture, even generations after the initial event has passed. This was not a rejection of hygiene, it was an act of psychological survival. In a time of incomprehensible horror, the villagers needed an answer, any answer, and they found it in the bathhouse. That space of intimacy became a scapegoat, an altar of false security now drenched in imagined death. What once united them became the very thing that tore them apart. And so, the village's legacy endures, not in books, but in silence, in the way their descendants cleaned their skin with cloth, not water, in how they flinched from touch, in the eerie truth that one of history's deadliest plagues didn't just kill people, it killed traditions, one warm night at a time. Why soap makers were feared and avoided. They were essential, yet exiled, makers of cleanliness, yet viewed as unclean. In the medieval world, few professions carried such a paradoxical burden as the soap maker. To the modern mind, soap conjures images of purity, health, and scent. But rewind several hundred years, and the soap maker was a symbol of stench, danger, and something almost cursed. In towns from France to England, these craftsmen lived and worked at the very edge of society, literally. Their homes and workshops were often built far beyond the city gates, not because their craft wasn't valuable, but because the process of making soap was something most people couldn't bear to be near. To create soap in the medieval period, one needed two things: animal fat and lye. Fat came from rendered carcasses, goats, cows, pigs, horses. Lye, on the other hand, was often made by soaking wood ash in water, producing a caustic alkaline liquid that could dissolve flesh if mishandled. Combined and boiled, these ingredients created a transformation, a harsh, foul-smelling alchemy that yielded one of the most important products in medieval hygiene. But this was no delicate process. Boiling animal fat in open vats released thick, choking fumes that clung to hair and skin. The smell was unbearable, and in a world without modern ventilation, it drifted across fields and villages like a noxious ghost. It wasn't just unpleasant, it was feared, because people believed that bad smells carried disease. This belief in miasma, the theory that illness came from foul air, made soap makers suspect in the public eye. Their fumes were seen not just as offensive, but as dangerous. The smell of lye and fat together resembled rot, decay, even death. And if the stench of death brought plague, then surely those who created such fumes were harboring illness themselves. Rumors spread easily in medieval towns. Children were warned not to walk near a soap maker's hut. Some whispered that prolonged exposure to the fumes caused madness. Others claimed that soap makers were cursed, that their proximity to death and filth gave them bad luck, or worse, the evil eye. They were avoided in markets, rarely invited to public gatherings, and often denied entry into guilds that other tradesmen took for granted. And yet, their product was necessary. Nobles demanded soap for their linens. Religious orders required it for ritual purity. Surgeons used crude soap to cleanse instruments, and bathhouses relied on it to maintain even a facade of sanitation. But no one wanted to think about where it came from, or who endured the stinking cauldrons to produce it. Some towns went so far as to write laws keeping soap makers at specific distances from city centers. In 13th century London, soap boilers were legally confined to certain wards. In Marseille, France, a city famous for its later soap industry, early soap makers were not permitted to operate within the main districts at all. Their workshops were regarded as hazards, not enterprises. The irony is thick. The very act of creating a product meant to clean the body, meant to protect it, was viewed as a source of contamination. And indeed, the dangers were real. Lye could blind a man in seconds if splashed. Burns were common. Accidental inhalation of boiling fat fumes could cause permanent lung damage. Soap making was not only noxious, it was deadly. So why did they do it? For many, it was a family trade. Knowledge of lye ratios and fat renderings passed down through generations. Others turned to soap making as a last resort when all other guilds refused them. The job was thankless, the work toxic, the social cost high. But there was always demand, always someone in need of the thing no one wanted to talk about. Some soap makers leaned into their reputation. They lived like hermits, rarely speaking, shrouded in soot and oil. Others tried to shake off the stigma, creating perfumed soaps for the wealthy, an attempt to mask their own identity in the fragrance of lavender or rose. But the stain remained. For centuries, to be a soap maker was to be feared, mistrusted, and often despised. Superstition only made it worse. In some regions, it was believed that soap makers consorted with spirits, that their fumes were not from earthly fire, but from hellish pacts. If illness struck a neighborhood, suspicion often fell first on the soap maker, regardless of distance or evidence. During outbreaks of the plague, some were run out of town entirely, their vats smashed, their homes burned. The fact that soap could help prevent disease didn't matter. Fear overpowered fact. It wasn't until science began to understand the nature of germs centuries later that the narrative began to change, with Pasteur and others proving that disease came from microbes, not smell. The myth of the dangerous soap maker slowly unraveled. Soap was reclaimed as a miracle of chemistry. But by then, the image had already taken root in collective memory, the figure hunched over boiling cauldrons, shrouded in smoke, cursed by his own craft. Today, artisan soaps are sold in polished shops and boutique markets, but their origin story is far from clean. Behind every bar lies a history soaked in fear, isolation, and the alchemical courage of those who dared to transform decay into purity, knowing full well the world would never thank them for it. The next time you lather your hands or breathe in the scent of sandalwood, remember this: cleanliness was once forged in fire and fear, and those who gave it to us did so at the cost of being forever unclean in the eyes of their world. The royal baby who wasn't bathed for 2 years. In the glittering halls of royal palaces, where gold leaf adorned ceilings and servants moved in silent discipline, there lay an infant swaddled in silk and secrecy, a child of kings, destined for crown and ceremony. And yet, for the first 2 years of life, this royal baby was never bathed, not once. This isn't legend, it's fact. Historical records from royal households in 15th and 16th century Europe reveal a practice that seems unthinkable today. Noble infants were often not immersed in water for months, sometimes even years. Instead, their bodies were cleaned only with soft linen cloths, dry powders, and aromatic oils. A gentle pat, a careful dusting, but never a bath. Why? Because in the eyes of medieval physicians and royal caretakers, bathing wasn't care, it was danger. To submerge a child in water was believed to risk their very life. Their logic, strange to us now, was rooted in the ancient concept of the 4 humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. These humors governed everything: personality, health, fate. And in newborns, they were thought to be especially delicate, easily disturbed, vulnerable to imbalance from the slightest exposure to cold, heat, or moisture. Water, particularly cold water, was viewed as a threat to that balance. Bathing a baby could shock the system, open the skin, and allow disease to seep in. Even warm water, if improperly prepared, could soften the spirit or weaken the constitution. In royal courts where physicians held almost mystical authority, such theories were law. So instead of water, infants were kept wrapped in layers of fabric, swaddled tightly, sometimes from neck to toe, their movement restricted for weeks on end. This wasn't just a practice, it was a philosophy. Swaddling was believed to shape the body correctly, to align limbs, and prevent deformity. The infant, like a sacred object, was protected from the world by layers of silk, wool, and custom. And beneath all those layers, the child sweat, cried, dirtied themselves. but the bath never came. Instead, nursemaids used cloths soaked in wine or rosewater to wipe the skin. Powders, often made of crushed herbs, chalk, or even lead, were applied to absorb moisture and scent. In some records, perfumes were used not for luxury, but as medicine. A sweet-smelling child, it was thought, was a healthy child. A sour one? A sign of humoral corruption. There is a surviving record from the Spanish court that details the care of Prince Don Carlos, son of Philip II. He was never bathed in water for his first 2 years of life. Physicians feared it would disrupt the balance of his developing organs. His nurses cleaned him with cloth and powder daily, changing his wrappings but never allowing exposure to air or water. When he later grew violent, unstable, and chronically ill, some would argue these methods had failed. But no one ever suggested bathing him might have been the solution. These beliefs weren't confined to Spain. In Tudor England, records show Queen Elizabeth herself was bathed only occasionally as a child. Later, as monarch, she prided herself on bathing once a month, whether she needed it or not. Even that frequency was considered progressive by the standards of the time. Among the French aristocracy, noble infants were considered too sacred, too fragile to be doused in water. Wet nurses and caretakers were instructed to avoid drafts, cold floors, and anything that might stir the child's humors. Bathing was reserved for emergencies, like illness or religious ritual, not routine. Even as late as the 17th century, European medical texts warned of overwashing infants, claiming it could cause palsy, slow speech development, or dull the senses. Cleanliness, it turns out, was a matter of medical suspicion, not maternal love. And so, beneath canopies of lace, behind doors guarded by liveried footmen, royal babies lay untouched by water, born into power but wrapped in ignorance, bathed in light but never in soap. The irony is sharp. These children had access to the finest linens, oils, and mines of their age. They were heir to kingdoms, but denied the most basic form of care we now consider essential. And yet, their caretakers weren't neglectful. They were meticulous, devoted, acting on the best knowledge they had. This history is not a tale of cruelty, but of caution taken to the edge of danger. We now know what they didn't, that bacteria, not bad humors, cause illness. That regular gentle bathing is one of the most powerful tools for infant health. That water heals, soothes, protects. But in those candlelit chambers of the past, water was fear. Water was wild. Water was the unknown. So the next time you imagine the life of a royal baby, cloaked in jewels, cooed over by courtiers, remember this: under all the pageantry, there was discomfort. Under the crown, a body untouched by water. And surrounding that child, a world that believed the greatest threat to their life was a bath. The bath that caused a panic. When a noble fainted after washing. In the year 1322, in a wealthy manor house surrounded by rolling fields and silence, a single splash echoed louder than a battle cry. A nobleman, respected, powerful, and accustomed to the finest comforts, lowered himself into a steaming bath prepared by his attendants. It was supposed to soothe his aching limbs after a long hunt, but what followed would ignite years of fear and folklore, casting shadows over something once considered clean and civilized. As he emerged from the bath, his skin flushed and his breath shallow, he collapsed, unmoving, pale. The manor erupted in panic. Servants rushed in, healers were summoned, and though he eventually regained consciousness, the damage was already done, not to his body, but to the region's faith in bathing itself. For in the wake of that nobleman's collapse, a strange new suspicion began to take root. Physicians of the day, lacking modern knowledge of circulation or hydration, reached for the tools they had, humoral theory, and they concluded, with trembling authority, that the bath had disturbed his internal balance, his vital fluids thrown into chaos by the sudden heat. To us, it may sound absurd, but in the medieval world, the four humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile were the pillars of medical understanding. Health was thought to depend on their perfect equilibrium, and warm water, these doctors warned, was a silent saboteur. It could draw blood away from the organs. It could overexcite the heart. It could loosen the spirit from the flesh. Word of the incident spread swiftly, first among nobles, then through towns and villages. The story warped and grew. Some claimed the bath nearly killed him. Others whispered he was never the same again. A few even said a demon had entered through the steam. What mattered more than fact was fear, and that fear began to shape behavior. In households that once prized their private tubs, dust began to gather on the wooden rims. Servants hesitated to prepare hot baths unless commanded. Some lords began to wash with cool water only, citing caution over indulgence. A few abstained from full bathing entirely, relying instead on dry cloths and scented oils. The fear wasn't universal, but in the noble courts and nearby regions it was palpable. This wasn't the first time bathing had come under scrutiny. Earlier, in 13th century religious circles, excessive washing had been linked to vanity. And during plagues, doctors feared that open pores from hot baths allowed diseases to seep into the body. But this 1322 incident was different. It wasn't spiritual sin or pestilence. It was a nobleman, a symbol of strength and authority, undone by water. That image haunted the collective mind. Physicians began issuing more cautious advice. In some manuscripts from the 1330s, we find recommendations to avoid baths unless sick, and even then, to do so only with tepid water. Medical treatises warned of faintness after steeping, citing the 1322 nobleman without naming him. His collapse had become a case study, a cautionary tale, a ghost in the tub. The irony is sharp. Many public and private bathhouses were by this time sophisticated. Some featured steam rooms, perfumed water, even early plumbing. The culture of bathing, inherited in part from the Romans, had enjoyed a quiet revival in certain parts of Europe. Yet this one incident, this one fainting spell, was enough to chill that momentum, at least locally. And so for years, that region's relationship with bathing grew complicated. Cleanliness became entwined with risk. The very act of self-care became a gamble, not because of disease, but because of the fear of losing control, of slipping into unconsciousness and never returning. Hot water, once a comfort, became a hidden threat. Warmth turned to worry. Soap turned to suspicion. Of course, time moved on. Medical knowledge crept forward. People bathed again. The nobleman lived. But the echoes of that moment endured far longer than the water's steam. It became part of the tapestry of medieval belief that the body must not be tampered with too boldly, that nature's balance, once disrupted, might punish even the most powerful. And perhaps that is what makes the story so compelling. Not the bath itself, but what it revealed. A civilization so preoccupied with invisible forces, so ruled by unseen fears, that even hot water could become an agent of danger. This wasn't just a medical misunderstanding. It was a glimpse into the fragile psychology of an age where science had not yet wrestled truth from tradition, where a single fainting man could cause a culture to step back from the tub and ask, what else are we getting wrong? When smell wasn't shameful, it was holy. In today's world, body odor is something to be eliminated, masked by soaps, deodorants, perfumes. But step back into the silence of a medieval monastery, where the scent of unwashed bodies mingled with candle smoke and incense, and you'll find a radically different philosophy. There was a time when smell, earthy, pungent, human, was not shameful. It was sacred. In the cloisters of medieval Europe, where monks and nuns withdrew from worldly pleasure to chase divine purity, the body was seen not as something to be beautified, but to be endured. The flesh was a cage for the soul, a distraction, a source of temptation. And the more one subdued it, through fasting, sleep deprivation, flagellation, or even filth, the closer one believed they came to God. In this worldview, a clean body could be a spiritual liability, because to clean the body was to care for it, and to care too much for the body was to risk vanity, a sin. Monastic orders often encouraged or even mandated the rejection of bodily cleanliness. Some saints went decades without bathing. Saint Agnes reportedly never once washed her feet. Saint Catherine of Siena, whose intense spiritual devotion inspired followers and confounded physicians, refused to bathe, wear clean clothes, or even brush her hair. Her body reportedly emitted a powerful odor, but this, in the eyes of many, was not a failing. It was the fragrance of sanctity, the smell of sacrifice. Why? Because in the monastic imagination, physical dirt was often linked to moral purity. If the body was meant to be crucified, so to speak, through discipline and denial, then enduring one's own stench, and that of others, was a form of spiritual strength. To smell bad was to resist earthly pleasures. To ignore hygiene was to prove that your thoughts were higher, your focus truer, your soul detached from the material world. Religious texts reinforce this belief. Writings from early church fathers and medieval theologians warned against bathing too frequently. Cleanliness, they argued, led to pride. A fresh face invited compliments. Soft, fragrant skin was a trap, an invitation to lust, to vanity, to sin. The devil, it was said, could slip through such weaknesses like perfume through air. Better to wall yourself in with spiritual grime than let the enemy through polished gates. Monasteries did not outlaw bathing entirely, but they restricted it. In the Benedictine rule, monks were allowed to bathe on rare occasions, typically for illness or extreme dirtiness. For most, that meant a handful of baths per year, if that. Even hand washing was sometimes seen as indulgent. Water was precious, but even more so, it was dangerous. It could cleanse the skin, but invite pride. It could wash away filth, but stir up desire. Thus, abstaining from cleanliness became a holy act. In some monastic circles, this belief was carried to extremes. There are reports of hermits living in caves, their bodies crawling with lice, their clothes fused to their skin. Yet when pilgrims visited them, they did not recoil. They wept. Because these saints, they believed, had transcended the concerns of flesh. The odor was not a failure. It was evidence of their detachment, of their discipline, of their divine obsession. The idea took hold beyond monasteries. Among certain lay communities, spiritual men and women adopted similar practices. They avoided soap, shunned perfume, and let their bodies decay in slow, sacred protest against the vanity of the world. Their smell became a badge of holiness. Their discomfort was an offering. And in a world where saints were revered more for their suffering than their appearance, it made sense. This belief did not exist in a vacuum. It was part of a broader theology of suffering. Pain brought you closer to Christ. Hunger, fatigue, stench, these were the echoes of the cross. The body, in its natural state, was not to be indulged, but endured. And so, monks who reeked of sweat, decay, and spiritual fervor were often admired. Their smell was the incense of sacrifice, proof that they had given up the world. But this wasn't only about spiritual ideals. It was also about control. In cloistered communities, the suppression of cleanliness became a way to suppress individuality. When everyone smells, nobody is special. When everyone endures discomfort, nobody complains. The absence of bathing wasn't just about piety. It was about submission, about hierarchy, about power cloaked in faith. Over time, these views would slowly erode. The Renaissance brought new ideas about the body, new admiration for beauty, health, anatomy. Bathhouses returned, soap became fashionable, cleanliness began its long climb from sin to virtue. But for centuries, especially in the narrow stone halls of the devout, the body's natural odor was not something to hide. It was something to honor, a sign that the soul had not been distracted by flesh. And so, the next time you step into a shower without a second thought, Remember this. Once, the absence of bathing was a prayer. Once, the smell of a human body, raw, unwashed, overwhelming, was believed to carry the scent of heaven. Not because it was pleasant, but because it meant the soul had chosen something higher, and chosen it completely. The bathing ban during Lent, dirtiness as a sign of devotion. In the candlelit corridors of medieval Christendom, where suffering was sanctified and the body was seen as a vessel of temptation, even the simple act of washing could be interpreted as a spiritual betrayal. This was a time when the Church did not merely guide prayers, it shaped every part of daily life, from the crops you planted to the cleanliness of your skin. And when the sacred season of Lent arrived, 40 days of fasting, abstinence, and reflection before Easter, the Church's gaze turned inward toward the body itself. Not only what one consumed, but how one lived in their flesh. In this season of penance, some regions of Europe implemented a peculiar command: stop bathing. To us, the idea seems counterintuitive. How could abstaining from cleanliness be a sign of holiness? But for those immersed in the worldview of the 13th and 14th centuries, the logic was cruelly precise. Lent was meant to mimic the suffering of Christ in the desert, a time of deprivation, temptation, and triumph through discipline. Food was restricted, luxuries were renounced, and comfort in any form was suspect. Bathing, especially in warm water, was considered pleasurable, and pleasure during Lent was an affront to the sacrifice of the Savior. The idea wasn't merely metaphorical. Physical suffering, even minor discomforts like itching skin or the sting of sweat, was believed to purify the soul. To bathe was to remove that trial. To wash away suffering was to reject penance. And so, in monastic orders and devout communities across parts of France, Germany, and Italy, a strange form of devotion took hold: the intentional embrace of filth. In many monasteries, especially among the more ascetic Benedictines and Cistercians, bathing was discouraged not just during Lent, but throughout much of the year. The logic was simple: vanity had no place among the godly, and during Lent, that principle intensified. Cleanliness became indulgence. The stink of the flesh was a badge of endurance. Even among the laity, this belief found root. Some villages passed down local customs forbidding bathing until Easter morning. That first cleansing after 40 days was meant to represent both bodily and spiritual renewal, an act of symbolic resurrection, rising clean into the light after weeks of chosen darkness. This was not universal. Not every bishop enforced such decrees, and many cities maintained public bathhouses that remained open during Lent, albeit under quieter patronage. But in the more pious or rural regions, the Church's teachings seeped deep into daily life, and priests warned from pulpits, "Beware the temptation of the bath." To indulge the body was to forget the soul. Medieval theologians such as Peter Damian railed against what they saw as the sensuality of bathing. They linked it to vanity, to pride, to lust. After all, to spend time attending to the body, an entity they believed was inherently corrupt, was to give in to earthly distractions. This thinking didn't emerge from nowhere. The early Church Fathers, from Augustine to Jerome, had long held a complex relationship with the body, often painting it as a battleground between the divine and the profane. By the High Middle Ages, this tension had hardened into doctrine. And so, during Lent, when the call to suffer became law, dirtiness transformed into a kind of sanctity. Those who walked through town with unwashed faces and greasy hair were not shamed, but sometimes admired. Their stench, their stains, these were the marks of their spiritual struggle. To scrub too soon, to seek fragrance or softness, was to cheat that trial. Lent wasn't meant to be easy. It was meant to be endured. There were exceptions, of course. The sick, the elderly, or those preparing for sacraments like baptism or marriage were often permitted to bathe. But these were not seen as indulgent acts. They were necessities wrapped in ritual, and even then, the water might be cold, unperfumed, and brief. The goal was not to comfort, but to cleanse just enough to meet divine expectations. Interestingly, this rejection of cleanliness during Lent sometimes had the opposite effect after it ended. Easter Sunday, marking Christ's resurrection, became a time of physical and spiritual renewal. On that morning, people bathed in rivers, anointed themselves with oils, wore fresh linen. For a brief moment, the body and the soul were allowed to be in harmony. The dirt of the past weeks washed away not only from skin, but from conscience. This tension between purity and suffering, between body and spirit, lingered in Christian thought for centuries. It echoed through sermons and silent vigils, shaping how people understood their place in the world. In a time without knowledge of bacteria or germ theory, bathing was less about hygiene and more about meaning. Water wasn't seen as neutral. It was a moral agent, either a temptation or a baptism. And so, for many in medieval Christendom, to remain unwashed during Lent was not laziness. It was worship. The grime on their hands, the sour scent of sweat beneath their robes, these were prayers offered in silence. A willingness to bear discomfort, to resist indulgence, and to show God not just their obedience, but their willingness to suffer in His name. In the darkened chapels and narrow village paths of the medieval world, where every breath of incense mingled with the earthy scent of skin unwashed for weeks, devotion was not always beautiful. Sometimes it was dirty, and that, they believed, was holy. The plague doctors, who refused to wash after treating patients. In the shadowed corridors of death, when Europe's streets echoed with the tolling bells of plague carts, there walked figures that were both feared and revered, plague doctors. They wore bird-like masks, long leather coats, and dark gloves, drifting through infected neighborhoods like grim reapers with notebooks. But what few recall today is one of the most chilling details of their daily routine. Many of them refused to wash. To modern ears, it sounds unthinkable, refusing to bathe after tending to the dying. But for these doctors, hygiene was not a tool of survival. It was a threat. In the 14th through the 17th centuries, long before germ theory reshaped medicine, people believed that disease spread through invisible poison carried by foul air, what they called miasma. The theory suggested that bad smells, rather than microbes, penetrated the body through pores in the skin. And the worst thing you could do, they believed, was open those pores wide. Hot water, steam, even friction from washing was thought to expand the pores, weakening the body's natural defenses. So instead of cleansing, plague doctors layered themselves in filth. Some didn't change clothes for weeks. Many never washed their hands or faces between visits to the sick. They believed the accumulation of grime actually sealed the skin, trapping any disease particles outside rather than letting them in. Their protective uniform was carefully designed to repel the poisonous air. The long leather overcoat was coated in wax or animal fat to block fumes. Gloves and boots were sealed. The infamous beaked mask, stuffed with pungent herbs, dried flowers, camphor, or vinegar-soaked sponges. These weren't just for the stench. They were meant to filter the air itself, to purify every breath. Some doctors even filled their pockets with lavender or mint, constantly inhaling from handkerchiefs soaked in rose water. They believed the aroma could counteract the corruption in the air. It was not medicine. It was survival by superstition. But still, they did not wash, not after visiting a plague house, not after touching infected bodies, not even after delivering last rites beside children too weak to cry. Instead, many would return home and hang their garments by the fire, hoping the heat would cleanse them without opening their pores. The result was a stench almost as legendary as the plague itself. Some records describe doctors being physically avoided by other citizens, not because they were feared healers, but because their unwashed presence was unbearable. Their leather rotted, mold grew in the seams of their coats, sweat mixed with decay, and still they persisted. And not all plague doctors were trained physicians. Many were volunteers, outcasts, or men seeking payment from desperate towns. Cities hired them with promises of gold, if they survived. Some took the job because no one else would. Others saw it as a grim duty, knowing full well they'd likely die alone, remembered only by the black masks and heavy steps echoing through narrow alleys. To these men, washing was a weakness. Water was treachery. And death was not just in the touch, it was in the air, in the breath, in the heat of a bath. In the 17th century, during outbreaks in places like Venice and London, written records show physicians advising against bathing altogether during plague time. Pamphlets warned readers that water invites illness. That sweat was the body's way of purging disease, not something to be rinsed away. Even among the upper classes, bathing fell out of fashion. Cleanliness, they believed, could kill. So the plague doctor, draped in layers of leather and linen, became a walking paradox, a figure tasked with healing, yet covered in decay, a man who carried medicine in one hand and fear in the other. But the filth wasn't just physical, it became symbolic. The longer a doctor refused to wash, the more he proved his dedication. The more his clothing absorbed the stench of death, the more powerful his presence seemed. He became a living talisman, reeking of suffering, but untouchable in the eyes of the dying. And yet, many did die. The mask, the herbs, the sealed layers, they were not enough. The disease pierced the illusion. Some doctors made it mere days. Others lasted weeks before coughing blood and collapsing in the very streets they once patrolled. Those who survived were forever altered, haunted not just by the bodies, but by the weight of the dirt they refused to wash away. Modern science would later reveal the truth they could not see, that the very act they feared most, cleansing, might have saved lives. That soap and water, the simplest rituals, held the power to stop the spread of invisible death. But in their world, darkness was fought with myths. They wore the mask, they carried the herbs, and they embraced the grime, because to be clean was to be vulnerable. And vulnerability had no place in the plague doctor's creed. So when you imagine these ghostly figures stalking the alleys of infected towns, don't just picture the beaked mask. Picture the sweat beneath, the crusted layers, the gloves that hadn't been removed in days, the breath laced with dried sage. Picture the man inside, afraid not of the disease, but of washing it away. And remember this, they walked unwashed, not because they didn't care, but because they cared too much. In their silence, in their filth, in their sacrifice, they tried, against all odds, to hold back the tide of death. But in doing so, they became part of the darkness they sought to defeat. How medieval laundry was cleaner than people. In the shadowed centuries of medieval Europe, when plague spread like whispers and superstition ruled the body, it might surprise you to learn this: the people themselves were often unwashed, but their clothes were not. Imagine it. A man walks into a cathedral, draped in layers of wool and linen. His skin hasn't touched water in weeks, perhaps months. But his tunic? Scrubbed, beaten, boiled, hung beneath the sun until the last hint of odor was driven out. The paradox is real, and it's buried in the heart of medieval hygiene. While bathing was feared, believed to open the pores and invite illness, laundry had no such stigma. In fact, it was encouraged. And though it sounds like a contradiction, it made perfect sense in their world. The body was sacred and fragile. Exposing it to water was seen as reckless, even dangerous. But clothes? Clothes could be scrubbed without risk. So they were, relentlessly. Linen undergarments, worn closest to the skin, were especially targeted. These simple shifts, chemises or braies, were the unsung heroes of medieval sanitation. Unlike heavy wool outer garments, which were rarely washed in full, linen pieces were cleaned frequently and harshly. Women, usually peasants or laundresses, hauled laundry to rivers or town washhouses. There, they beat the cloth with wooden paddles, rinsed it in freezing water, and sometimes used lye made from wood ash. There was no soap as we know it. Instead, mixtures of ash, urine, or even fermented animal fat were used to break down oils and odors. It was rough, smelly, brutal work, and it worked. While bodies remained layered in sweat, dust, and superstition, clothes were often the only thing keeping infection and social shame at bay. To wear visibly dirty garments was to risk mockery, suspicion, or worse, to be seen as morally unclean. In medieval society, cleanliness wasn't about health, it was about status, and clothes were a public statement. A clean tunic told the world that you were virtuous, respectable, orderly, even if your hair hadn't seen water in a season. This created a strange hierarchy. A person's outward cleanliness could be entirely fabricated through fabric. You could stink beneath your robes, but as long as your sleeves were scrubbed, your linen bright, your hems intact, you passed as presentable. Holy, even. The church, too, played a part. Monastic orders required clean habits. Nuns washed their robes weekly. Priests had altar cloths boiled and bleached, not out of health concerns, but to symbolize purity. To them, soap didn't clean sin, but white linen might suggest it had been cleansed. We even find written records, household manuals, monastery logs, city laws, detailing how often clothes should be washed. In some towns, public washing days were established. In wealthier homes, servants laundered garments in private courtyards. In the countryside, women knelt on riverbanks, their hands raw from scrubbing. Even royalty took laundry seriously. King Louis IX of France famously wore fine, white linen and demanded it be changed and washed often, despite the fact that his skin was rarely bathed. In his eyes, it was the linen that mattered most. A noble could smell like sweat, but they could never look impure. Laundry was so critical, in fact, that some medieval cities imposed fines for washing clothes in drinking water sources. In Paris, laws regulated which riverside zones could be used for laundry, separating them from the fountains and wells meant for cooking or drinking. Why? Because laundry required strong chemicals. Ashes, wine, even urine, and water contamination became a real concern. And yet somehow, even with all this attention paid to garments, the belief persisted that touching water too often, especially with your bare skin, was unnatural. Wrong. A risk to your soul and body. This led to strange routines. People would change their undergarments regularly, but not wash their bodies. They would soak tunics in lye, but refuse a foot bath. They would bleach linen, but let their own teeth rot. To the modern mind, it seems backward, but in their logic, the visible mattered more than the visceral. Clean clothes meant clean conscience. This attitude persisted for centuries. Even during the height of the Renaissance, Queen Elizabeth I, one of the most powerful women in history, reportedly bathed only once a month, yet changed her gowns and linens almost daily. Her image was carefully cultivated, regal, radiant, divine. And it was her wardrobe, not her hygiene, that helped sell that illusion. So when we imagine medieval Europe as a dirty, disease-ridden mess, we forget the nuance. Yes, bodies were often unwashed. But clothing? Clothing carried the burden of cleanliness. It absorbed the sweat. It protected the skin. And it bore the ritual of cleansing in its place, and those who washed it, the laundresses, the peasant women, the unseen hands at the rivers, were the quiet defenders of that illusion. They scalded, scrubbed, and boiled the garments of a society that feared water more than it feared dirt. And through them a strange kind of hygiene endured. Today, we celebrate hot showers and scented soaps. But for centuries, it was the slap of cloth on stone, the hiss of boiling lye, and the crackling dry heat of sun-bleached linen that defined what it meant to be clean. Not the skin beneath, but the story the fabric told. Why cold water was considered more dangerous than fire. In the Middle Ages, when the world was lit by candlelight and ruled by mystery, a paradox quietly ruled medicine. Cold water, so pure, so still, was feared more than fire. Not for drowning, not for the chill of winter alone, but because doctors believed cold water could kill you from the inside out. It wasn't superstition, it was science. At least, their version of it. According to humoral theory, which dominated European medicine for over 1,000 years, the body was governed by four essential fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health was balance, illness was imbalance, and temperature was one of the key forces that could tilt that delicate scale. Cold was not just a sensation, it was a threat to the internal order of the body, especially when it came in the form of sudden immersion. To plunge into cold water, they believed, was to risk the heart itself freezing mid-beat. Physicians wrote of cardiac shock, though they didn't use those exact words. They spoke, instead of the hardening of the organs, of blood retreating from the limbs and pooling in the chest, of vital heat being stolen by the water. The result? Collapse, coma, death. And so, falling into a cold stream was not simply an accident. It was often treated like a death sentence. Monastic scribes recorded tales of young men who fell while crossing icy rivers, only to die not of injury, but of soul withdrawal, as one text put it. No attempt was made to resuscitate. In fact, in some places, to pull a man from a cold river after more than a few minutes was seen as pointless. The water had taken his warmth, and with it, his life. In a world without central heating, without thermal clothes, without any understanding of hypothermia or circulation, this made sense. People saw firsthand what cold did to the weak, the old, the sick. Limbs stiffened, skin turned blue, breath slowed. Sometimes it stopped altogether, but it went deeper than observation. It became cultural doctrine. In noble households, bathing in cold water was discouraged except in rare cases of fever. Warm water was preferred, as it opened the pores and allowed for purification. Cold water, they said, closed the pores too quickly, trapping disease inside. Even a splash of cold water on the face in the morning was thought to risk dizziness or nosebleeds if done too suddenly. And yet, fire, symbol of destruction, was treated with almost ritual respect. It could burn, yes, but it was also a cleanser. It symbolized purification, divine judgment, transformation. In medical texts, heat was considered active, lively, even curative. Doctors used heated oils, poultices, and even cauterization with iron rods. A burned wound could be survived. A cold body, they feared, might not be saved. There's a strange poetry to this. The element that gives comfort, cold water, was the one they feared. The one that scorched, fire, was something they believed they could control. We find this belief echoing in strange corners of medieval life. Some doctors wrote that cold water could strike the lungs, triggering sudden coughing fits, believed to be the spirit of the water trying to escape. Others claimed it could cause madness by chilling the seat of the mind. Even spiritual metaphors borrowed this fear, the warmth of God's light versus the chill of the devil's void. The irony is, they weren't entirely wrong. We know now that cold water immersion can cause cold shock response, an immediate gasp, rapid heart rate, and possible cardiac arrest in vulnerable individuals. Sudden immersion, especially in icy conditions, has killed many. The danger is real. But the medieval fear extended beyond biology. It became psychological, cultural, and ultimately spiritual. In some villages, tales were told of spirits that lived in cold rivers, souls of the drowned, whispering from beneath the ice. Children were warned not just to avoid falling in, but not to listen too closely to the water, lest it tempt them. Fear and folklore mixed into one frigid truth: cold water could end you, quietly and quickly. Fire, they knew, screamed. Cold water whispered. Perhaps that's what made it worse. You could see fire's damage, smell it, hear it crackle. But cold stole silently. It worked from within, unseen, unspoken. until the body went still, the warmth fled, and there was nothing left but a pale shell. And so, for centuries, the people of medieval Europe treated rivers with caution, avoided cold baths, and listened to the warnings of their doctors, not because they were fools, but because they had seen too many disappear into the cold and never return the same. The belief would linger long after the science evolved. Even today, echoes remain. The chill that crawls down your spine in winter, the hesitation before diving into icy water, the old fear that something too cold might not just hurt, but end you. It's an old memory, a medieval ghost, still whispering from beneath the stream. The pilgrims who refused to wash on sacred journeys. They set out not with comfort in mind, but with calloused feet and aching faith. In the age of cathedrals and relics, where miracles were sought and salvation was walked toward, thousands of medieval pilgrims left home on sacred journeys across Europe. They marched toward Rome, to Canterbury, to Santiago de Compostela, not in search of leisure, but in search of redemption. And many of them did something that to modern eyes seems almost unfathomable. They refused to bathe, not by accident, but by conviction. To these travelers, water was not just scarce, it was suspect. And even when rivers ran nearby, when rain softened the dust on their path, they still chose to remain unwashed, because their filth was not shameful, it was holy. In medieval Christian belief, physical suffering was a mirror of Christ's passion. To hurt was to imitate him, to hunger, to limp, to sleep in the cold, to blister and bleed and smell of one's own decay. This was sacred. It meant the journey was real, that the sacrifice was complete. Pilgrimage wasn't meant to be easy. It was meant to be transformative. The dirt that clung to a pilgrim's skin wasn't filth. It was proof of spiritual labor, a badge of devotion. Bathing, on the other hand, risked pride. To clean oneself too often was to court vanity, to distance oneself from humility. Many pilgrims feared that washing away the grime might also wash away the grace they had earned through suffering. They believed that every sore, every patch of sweat-soaked cloth, every cracked heel was noticed by heaven. To be clean was to seem untouched. To be dirty was to be worthy. Pilgrimage in the Middle Ages was rarely a solitary affair. Pilgrims traveled in groups, slept in shared hostels, ate whatever they were given, or not at all. They often walked for months. Some didn't make it home. The routes were perilous. Bandits, disease, bad weather, and injuries haunted every step. Yet, those who endured considered their hardship a sacred offering. And for some, the worst suffering wasn't the distance. It was the refusal to bathe. There are records of pilgrims arriving at shrines and holy sites caked in filth, their feet rotting in their shoes, lice swarming in their hair, their bodies oozing with the blisters of long travel. Yet these were not seen as disgraceful. Pilgrims like these were revered. Locals along the routes sometimes welcomed them with alms and food. Religious communities opened their doors. These were not just travelers, they were penitents, and their suffering carried weight. This belief also aligned with the larger medieval fear of bathing. Physicians warned against hot water, claiming it opened the pores and let in miasma, the foul air thought to carry disease. Public bathhouses had begun to close across Europe, often condemned by religious authorities for encouraging both lust and illness. In that climate of suspicion, foregoing baths on the road seemed not just wise, but righteous. And so the pilgrim walked on, wounded, tired, and unwashed. But each step, each day without a rinse, brought them closer to what they believed was divine attention. Their bodies grew darker, heavier, more worn. But their souls, they believed, grew brighter. Even their clothing reflected this mindset. Pilgrims often wore a simple cloak, a hat, and a scallop shell, the symbol of St. James. But the real garment they carried was invisible, the layered fabric of endurance, the smell of their journey, the pain of their sacrifice, the humility of their dirt. At shrines like Santiago de Compostela in Spain, pilgrims would arrive at the Grand Cathedral, kneel before relics, and offer thanks not for comfort, but for survival. Their grime was not cleaned away immediately. Often they wore it like armor for a final prayer. Only after did they bathe, sometimes symbolically, in a river near the shrine. This final cleansing was not practical, it was spiritual. It marked the end of the journey, the shedding of trial, a resurrection into the self who had earned grace. This practice even extended to the return trip. Some pilgrims chose to remain unwashed until they arrived home. They wanted their families to see their ordeal, to smell the pilgrimage on their skin, to witness the transformation. Because a pilgrimage wasn't just about reaching a destination, it was about proving something to God and to those left behind. And what does that say about how we understand cleanliness today? In the modern world, we use hygiene to hide our effort. We clean away the signs of labor, of stress, of journey. But for the medieval pilgrim, the opposite was true. Dirt was honesty. Odor was testimony. Pain was proof of passage. To them, it wasn't the clean who reached heaven fastest. It was the stained, the weary, the ones who walked through the world without shielding themselves from its weight. The ones who didn't wash off the journey before the journey was complete. In their world, the road to the sacred was not paved in purity, but in sweat, blood, and sacred dirt. The castle, with a bath, that no one used. In the heart of Central Europe, buried beneath centuries of moss, rubble, and silent superstition, archaeologists unearthed something strange in the ruins of a 13th century castle. A large stone tub, cut from a single block of limestone, rested perfectly preserved in a corner chamber, tucked away like a secret never told. Its rim was smooth, its basin uncracked. It was designed for luxury, large enough for a full adult to recline in, fed by an aqueduct that could carry water in from a nearby spring. Yet the strangest discovery wasn't the bath itself. It was the fact that it had never been used. No lime stains, no soap residue, no grooves from use, nothing to suggest water ever pooled in it at all. And when historians began to sift through regional texts and local legends, they discovered a chilling explanation. The people of that time, including those who lived in the very castle that housed the bath, believed that full-body bathing was dangerous, not just to the body, but to the soul. The belief wasn't based on laziness, nor on ignorance of cleanliness. It was rooted in a cultural fear that had gripped the medieval world tightly, that water, particularly hot water, could weaken the mind and open the spirit to corruption. This wasn't metaphor. They meant it quite literally. Throughout the 13th century, ideas about health and the body were deeply entangled with religion, superstition, and ancient medical theory. The dominant belief system, derived from the writings of Galen and passed down through centuries of clerical teaching, held that the human body functioned on a delicate balance of four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. These humors were easily disrupted by temperature, air, moisture, and emotion. And full-body immersion in hot water was thought to unseal the pores, making one vulnerable to disease, possession, and moral weakening. In this particular castle, the presence of a bath may have been symbolic, a status marker built under the influence of foreign customs, possibly inspired by the more frequent bathing practices of the Moors, Byzantines, or even crusading nobles who had traveled abroad. But while the stone was carved and the system built, local attitudes did not evolve with the architecture. The bath remained dry, a monument to intention never fulfilled. It's not that the lords or their servants did not wash. They did, carefully, partially, and with great caution. A basin of water for the face, a cloth for the hands, vinegar for the feet. But soaking the entire body was thought to be not only indulgent, but spiritually risky. Stories passed down in oral tradition warned that those who spent too long in warm water emerged, changed, not refreshed, but slow-witted, foggy-minded, spiritually exposed. Some tales told of noble women who began to weep uncontrollably after a bath, or of soldiers who lost their resolve after washing away the sweat of war. So powerful was this belief that it turned the very sight of the bath into something unsettling. Visitors described the stone tub as too smooth, too deep, or echoing, a silent vessel that invited a kind of vulnerability they feared. One chronicler described how a local priest had once warned a young page never to enter the chamber alone, lest the devil find him softened and distracted. Even among nobility, those who had the means to install such luxuries, there lingered a deep fear that to indulge the body too fully was to let the soul weaken. Medieval life was structured around survival, hardship, and spiritual vigilance. Anything that promised too much comfort was treated with suspicion. And so, in castles like this one, the bath became a paradox, an object of beauty and wealth designed for relaxation, yet associated with madness and spiritual erosion. What made this particular find so compelling for archaeologists wasn't just its preservation, it was the records they found nearby. In a locked chest, within the castle's old chapel archives, were fragments of letters and teachings passed between clerics and local lords. One letter, dated roughly to 1283, warned, "Let not the water hold you too long, for the body in warmth forgets God." Another, more ominous, claimed, "When a man makes leisure of the body, his soul will sleep, and in sleep the serpent comes." This wasn't hyperbole. For them, the soul's integrity was always under threat, from temptation, from weakness, from acts of comfort. The bath, in their eyes, was a threshold, and to cross it too eagerly was to risk drowning in more than just water. Centuries later, when researchers began excavating the castle's remains, they found signs of intense life all around it. Scraps of pottery, remnants of feasts, torn banners, children's toys buried in soot. But the bath chamber remained untouched, almost sacred in its sterility, as if everyone who lived in that castle had quietly agreed to pretend it wasn't there. Today, tourists might walk through such ruins and marvel at what seems to be misplaced luxury. But what they are seeing is more than a curiosity. It's a relic of fear, of philosophy, of belief. That bath was never used, not because people were ignorant, but because they believed, with the full weight of culture and religion behind them, that to submit to it would dull the edge of their very being. And so, the bath stands as a symbol, not of what was lost, but of what was feared. Not of forgotten comfort, but of remembered restraint. A stone cradle for water that never came. A monument to a people who chose, even in wealth, to remain dirty, because they believed that the clean body might invite a corrupted soul. When cleanliness meant suspicion, the girl accused of vanity. In the year 1355, in a village whose name has long been swallowed by time, a girl stood trial for witchcraft. But she had not conjured storms. She had not whispered curses into the wind or danced beneath the moon in secret. No, her crime was far simpler and far stranger. She bathed, she combed her hair, she wore clean robes, and for that, she was feared. Her name is lost to history, but her story echoes with chilling clarity. In a time when dirt was survival and stench was common, she was different. Her skin was clean. Her fingers smelled faintly of rosemary. Her clothes, washed in lye and river water, hung soft and pale around her slender frame. And her hair, always brushed, always braided, moved like silk in the wind. To us, that may sound like grace. To her neighbors, it looked like danger. The Middle Ages were not kind to those who strayed from the collective norm. Filth was not just tolerated, it was expected. In a society ravaged by plague, famine, and war, survival often meant blending in. Bathing was seen as suspicious. It was believed to weaken the body, open the pores to disease, and worse, to show vanity, a sin linked with pride, one of the deadliest of all. So, when a girl appeared in a rural village looking pure, it unsettled people. She wasn't wealthy, she had no status. Yet she carried herself like someone untouched by the world's ugliness, and that in itself was unnatural. It started with whispers. Children whispered that she must be hiding something in her bathwater, potions, spells, dark secrets. Women muttered that no one could stay that clean without help from unholy forces. And men, confused, perhaps ashamed of their fascination, chose judgment over curiosity. The local priest took note. A girl so devoted to appearance surely harbored a vain soul, and vanity, in the eyes of the church, opened the door to the devil. When a child in the village fell ill, people remembered the way the girl had walked past his house the day before. When a crop failed, they recalled that her robes had been too white. When a storm shattered the chapel's windows, it was said she had bathed the night before, and perhaps washed away the village's luck. Soon, suspicion hardened into accusation. They said she was using herbs to seduce men, that her comb was enchanted, that she whispered to her reflection in the water. No proof was needed. Her very cleanliness, her refusal to mar herself with dirt and despair, was proof enough. She was seized in the night. Dragged into the village square, she stood shivering, not from fear, but from the cold. Her captors had torn the sleeves from her robe, rubbed ash into her hair, tried to undo the very essence of who she was. But even then, even broken and humiliated, she did not beg. She simply asked, "Is it wrong to be clean?" No one answered. The villagers, trembling with superstition, decided to test her. They submerged her in water to see if she would float, an ancient and brutal trial. If she sank, she was innocent. If she floated, guilty. The logic made no sense. But fear rarely obeys reason. She floated. Perhaps it was her light frame. Perhaps it was the way her robes trapped air. Perhaps fate itself had grown weary. Whatever the cause, the verdict was clear in their eyes. Witch. No fire was lit. No gallows were built. Instead, she was cast out, banished, exiled, left to walk barefoot from the only home she had ever known, alone. And as she disappeared over the hills, her hair still braided, her robe still too white for comfort, the village returned to its filth, to its safety, to its fear. We do not know what became of her. Some say she died in the forest. Others whisper that she lived, found a hermit's hut, raised herbs in silence, never bathed in sunlight again. But her story lingered like perfume in a room long after she was gone. What makes this story terrifying is not its strangeness, but its familiarity. Because it wasn't magic that got her accused. It was beauty mistaken for deception, cleanliness mistaken for pride, individuality mistaken for threat. This wasn't the only case. Across Europe, records from witch trials show patterns that now seem grotesquely absurd. Women who wore bright colors, girls who laughed too freely, midwives who washed before deliveries, all of them viewed with suspicion. Because in a time of widespread filth and fear, anything that looked too different was assumed to be dangerous. Hygiene became a form of rebellion. To bathe was to separate oneself from the collective suffering of the village, and to do that, especially as a young woman, was an invitation for cruelty. We like to imagine the past as far away, as if we've outgrown these reflexes. But even now, how often are those who don't conform punished? How often is cleanliness equated with arrogance? How often are women, in particular, judged not for what they've done, but for how they appear? The girl in 1355 was not a witch. She was not vain. She was not dangerous. She was just clean. And that, in a world drowning in its own filth, physical, emotional, spiritual, was enough to make her a threat. So the next time you hear the phrase witch hunt, remember that it wasn't always about spells or sorcery. Sometimes it was about a girl who refused to be dirty, who dared to take care of herself, who chose dignity in a world that demanded decay. And that was unforgivable.